Hi everyone. So, this is part two of my investigation into the origins of the British Israelite movement, which spins off into Christian identity. In this talk, it's investigating more into where the origins of this movement started, its political repercussions, and where we're at today with the modern state of Israel situation and potentially Third World War with Iran. Okay, so this article here from Auto Ab Ko about the Moravian Church, and it says here Swedenborg, so Emanuel Swedenborg, was associated with the Fetter Lane Society, was the first flowering of the Moravian Church in England, founded by Count Nicholas Zinzendorf, a German religious and social reformer, bishop of the Moravian Church, and a major figure of 18th century Protestantism. The Moravian Church, formerly named the Unitas Fraternum, Latin for Unity of the Brethren, was derived from the Hussite movement started by Jan Hus in the early 15th century Bohemia, to which had belonged Bishop John Amos Comenius, a core member of the Hartlib Circle. Huss was burned at the stake at the Council of Constance in 1415, despite the protection he had received from King Wenceslas IV of Bohemia and his brother Sigmund, Holy Roman Empire and founder of the Order of the Dragon. Like the Rosicrucians, following the Protestant defeat at the Battle of the White Mountain in 1620, the Brethren were forced to operate underground and eventually dispersed across northern Europe as far as the Low Countries, where Communists attempted to direct a resurgence. After 1620, descendants of the Bohemian Brethren who stayed in Bohemia and Moravia, referred to as the Hidden Seed, which Communists had prayed would preserve the evangelical faith, made up the core of a regrouping a century later under the influence of Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf was raised by a grandmother who corresponded with Leibniz in Latin, read the Bible in Hebrew and Greek, and studied Syrian and Chaldean, and exposed him to themes of Jacob Boehme and Christian Kabbalism. This would bring Zinzendorf into contact with heterodox Jews, whose sympathies for the teachings of Sabbatai Zevi led them to positions close to Christian students of Kabbalah, seen by many pious as a medium between the two religions. Zinzendorf was the pupil and godson of the direct originator of Pietism, so out of Pietism came Puritanism, Philip Jacob Spener. Now, I have a video all about this. Pietism was the movement within Lutheranism that began in the late 17th century, whose forerunners were Jacob Boehme and Johann Valentin Andrea, the author of the Rosicrucian Manifesto. Interesting. Spener was powerfully influenced by the preaching of the converted Jesuit preacher Jean de Labadie. Is any Jesuit ever really converted? I don't believe that. Originally a Jesuit priest, Labadie became a member of the Reformed Church in 1650 before founding the community which became known in 1669. Labadie was among those who had been kept informed on the progress of Sabbatai Zevi's mission by Peter Sararis and spoke about the Sabbateans in his sermon. Labadie's movement attracted some notable female converts such as the famed poet and scholar Anna Maria van Sherman and the entomological artist Maria Merian. Among Sherman's friends were Dutch composer Constantin Huygens, who was in touch with René Descartes, Rembrandt, John Donne, and painter John Leavitt. Through correspondence in Latin, Hebrew, French, Sherman established a network of learned women across Europe, including John Dury's wife, Dorothea More. Now remember, John Dury was a Calvinist preacher and early promoter of the idea of British Israelism. Bathsheba Macon, the feminist Marie de Gournay, Marie du Moulin, Elizabeth of Bohemia, and Queen Christina of Sweden. Macon, who was influenced by the writings of Comenius, was known as the most learned woman in England and was tutor to the children of Charles I of England, the governess to his daughter Elizabeth Stuart. So Elizabeth Stuart was the daughter of King James of the King James Bible and the sister of King Charles the First of England, who promoted the idea that he had divine right to rule, like his father promoted the same idea. So it's ironic that this tutor that tutored her was influenced by the Moravian Church and the Sabbatean Frankists. So I just want to add here too that Bostonai, the Exarch line of David from Babylon, was the ancestor to Jacob Frank. The genealogy also suggests that he may have been an ancestor from the same family line to Sabbatai Zevi in the line of Jacob Frank, Shamu Zvi. Now, this is from the Maharal's house. The family of Maharal of Prague was a rabbi, Samuel Zvi, whose descendants end with Jacob Frank. So I'm going to suggest that Jacob Frank and Sabbatai Zevi were actually related. These particular line of rabbis also include the lineage of Rabbi Schneerson, who was considered the recent Chabad Lubavitch Messiah. So, we've got all these massive connections to these elites of England and the early pious movement, which was the Puritan movement and the Reformation, so it says, according to Masonic historian Arthur E. Waite, Zinzendorf organized his followers into a hierarchical secret society that functioned as an offshoot of irregular or illuminatist Freemasonry. In 1722, Zinzendorf created a secret society called the Order of the Grain of Mustard Seed, connected to Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism. The order was revived in 1739 when Zinzendorf managed to recruit to it the archbishops of Canterbury and Paris, as well as Christian VI, 1699 and 1746, King of Denmark. It was also one of the first innovatory orders introduced into the German Freemasonry, meaning orders which added new material, often Christian or Templar, to the traditional 3-degree system. In 1803, C. G. von Muir wrote that the Order of the Mustard Seed was a pale imitation of the Society of the Rosicrucians and a form of spiritual Freemasonry. Critics charge that Zinzendorf bestows orders of knighthood, while his initiates wore a Templar-style cross. The first article of the order affirmed that the members of our society will love the whole human family and, as crusaders for Christ, seek conciliation with the Jews. Hello. A group arrived in Philadelphia in 1731, followed by 5 more migrations up to 1737. There we go. So a lot of these are early American founders and Puritans. So this is on this website, OrdAbKO, worth checking out. Have a look at it. So getting back here, we can see this early influence of these people in the Puritan movement, and already in the early 1600s, an agenda to start this idea that of establishing a state of Israel, which I call a neo or new crusade, because that was the same agenda of the Roman Catholic Church and the Jewish bankers behind them in the Crusades, was to take back the Holy Land and establish the city of Jerusalem again under these aristocratic rulers. So here we have this other person who's linked to the early British Israel movement, and his name's Sharon Turner. He was an English historian. Turner was born in Pentonville, the eldest son of William and Anne Turner of Yorkshire, who had settled in London upon marrying. So Turner became a solicitor but left the profession after he became interested in the study of Icelandic and Anglo-Saxon literature. He settled himself in Red Lion Square near the British Museum, staying there for 16 years when his friend Isaac Disraeli left the synagogue after a dispute with the rabbi. Turner persuaded him to have his children, including the future Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, baptized in the Church of England to give them a better chance in life. Some of his manuscripts were written almost illegibly in the margins of letters, on the inside covers of magazines, or on discarded wax paper. His publishers sent him clean paper, but Turner did not use it. So Turner's History of the Anglo-Saxons appears in 4 volumes between 1799 and 1805. So here we see, we've got all these people linked to pushing of this state of Israel. I mean, Benjamin Disraeli's father was best friends with this guy, Sharon Turner. And here we have British Israelism. John Sadler, member of English Parliament, married the sister of John Harvard of Harvard University, a Puritan. And Sadler was a Philo-Semite. As we've read, that's a Judophile, is in defense or love, admiration of Jews, on friendly terms with Manasseh ben Israel, better known by his name of Manasseh or Manasseh ben Israel, was a Jewish scholar, rabbi, Kabbalist, writer, diplomat, printer, publisher, and founder of the first Hebrew printing press in Amsterdam in 1626. So Sadler believed that the resettlement of Jews in England was an informal arrangement during the Commonwealth of England in the mid-1650s, which allowed Jews to practice their faith openly. It forms a prominent part of the history of the Jews in England. It happened directly after 2 events. So he believed in the readmission would allow for the Jews to be converted to Christianity, which would hasten the new millennium. I don't know, were these people deceived, or were they part of this agenda to make this state of Israel come about? He was also associated with Samuel Hartlib, a Polish-born English educational and agricultural reformer of German-Polish origin who settled, married, and died in England. I mean, a lot of these were pseudo-Jews that changed to Protestantism to hide their background. Why is this important? Because they have an agenda to establish this state of Israel. Hartlib met the Scottish preacher John Dury in 1628. In the same year, Hartlib relocated to England, faced with the prospect of being caught in a war zone. So it says here, war zone, as imperial armies moved into western parts of Poland and the chance of intervention by Sweden grew. He first unsuccessfully set up a school in Chichester in line with his theories of education, and in 1630 moved permanently to London, living in Duke's Palace, Holborn. An early patron was John Williams, was a Welsh clergyman and political advisor to King James I. He served as Bishop of Lincoln, 1621 to 1641, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, 1621 to 1625, and Archbishop of York in 1641 to 1646. He was the last bishop to serve the Lord Chancellor. He was friends with John Milton. So we know John Milton wrote the whole mythology of the devil, Paradise Lost, an English poet. So for his various labours, Hartlib received a pension of £100 from Oliver Cromwell, afterwards increased to £300 as he had spent all his fortune on his experiments. But Hartlib died in poverty. Hartlib was indebted to Francis Bacon for a general theory of education that formed common ground for him and Jan Comenius. Hartlib published 2 studies of Comenius' work, Cognatum. He also put effort into getting Comenius of the Protestant Moravian Brethren So this is what we're just talking about with Zinzendorf. To visit England, John Dewey and Comenius were Hartlib's two closest correspondents. The latter had the concept of a tree of knowledge continually branching out and growing. He also put his own spin on Bacon's ideas. In 1640, he addressed the English Parliament with his utopian plans involved in a new commonwealth and the advancement of learning. Shortly before the English Civil War broke out, John Gordon preached in 1640 to Parliament recommending that Dewey and Comenius be invited to England and naming Hartlib as a likely contact. So what do we see about the Moravian Brethren? The Moravian Church was associated with Emanuel Swedenborg associated with the Fetter Lane Society, was the first flowering of the Moravian Church in England, founded by Count Nicholas Zinzendorf, who was associated with the Piety movement, and the Zinzendorf was also through his mother's side and his tutor associated to the Sabbatean Frankists. So Samuel Hartlib, a potential pseudo-Jewish person, I'm just saying, is connected to John Sadler, who is connected to the British Israelism movement. Now, John Wilson was an ideological architect of the British Israelism movement along with Edward Wheeler Bird. So he was self-educated man. 1840 he published Our Israelite. So, as I said, I'm not saying that they're wrong about what they found with the origins of the British people and the people of Europe. We've got this Hegelian game again. Here we have them telling the people of Europe that the Germans and the British people are lost tribes of Israel. And on the other hand, we have the same people who influenced the German Romantic movement and the pagan Nazi movement, Nazi party, saying that the people of Germany were Aryan. So, every angle and every level of understanding we come to, we have to see this Hegelian dialectic going on, because it's getting us to choose one side or the other. And we have to find the truth within the story, because these people knew the story at this time, and these people were behind controlling the story and giving us two sides to choose from that story. So the British are descendants of the lost tribes. The key components of British Israelism is that the representation of the migrations of the 10 tribes of Israel. Adherents suggested that the Scythians, Cimmerians, and Goths were representatives of these lost tribes and the progenitors of the later invaders of Britain. John Wilson would argue for the inclusion of all Western European Gothic peoples among the descendants of the Israelites, but under the later influence of Edward Hine, the movement would come to view only the people of British Isles as having this ancestry. So I'll have a look at this guy, Edward Hine. It says Herodotus reported that the ancient Persians called all of the Scythians Sake, but they called themselves Skolotai. However, a modern comparison of the forms which are given in other ancient languages suggests that the Skuda was their name. Ancient writers such as Josephus and Jerome would associate the Scythians with the people of Gog and Magog. And this is, we've got Ashkenazi people. We know that Gog and Magog were descendants of Japheth. It says, but the British Israelite entomologists would see that the Sake, a name derived from the biblical Isaac, claiming that the appearance of the Scythians they claim the lost tribes were last documented, also supported a connection. So I've done a bit of a video on this. I believe that it doesn't make sense to me that the Scythians were the lost tribes. Maybe they mixed with them. We do have a prophecy in Genesis that says that the sons of Japheth will live amongst the tents of Shem. And I believe, I've just been looking into this, and I honestly believe that the Cimmerians were definitely lost tribes. I mean, they show up in a region where the lost tribes were moved by the Assyrian Empire. out of nowhere in history, they show up. They wreak havoc in the region of modern-day Turkey, and then they disappear altogether and move on. They either assimilate into that region, but I dare say that they've moved on into Europe. They became the Gauls, the Gemeri, the Cimmerians, and the Goths. The Scythians, I think, were descendants of Japheth, and potentially the Cimmerians moved north past the Black Sea and past the Caucasus Mountains and may have mixed with the Scythians. But, the Scythians actually attacked Jerusalem at one point, and it does say in Isaiah, I believe, that, and I bring this up in my video, that Gog would attack Jerusalem, and they did do that. Further, British Israelites find support in the superficial resemblance between King Jehu's pointed headdress and that of the captive Saka king seen to the far right on the Behistun rock. They continue the chain of etymological identification leading from Isaac to the Sake to the Saxons, interpreted as Sack's sons or the sons of Isaac. Why would they be the sons of Isaac? I mean, Esau was the son of Isaac also. You'd want to be the sons of Jacob, who are portrayed as invading England from Denmark and the land of the tribe of Dan. They saw the same tribal name left by the wanderers of the Dandanelles, the Danube, Macedonia, Dunkirk, Dunglo in Ireland, Dundee in Scotland, Sweden, and London, and ascribed it to the lost tribe of mythical Irish Tanúdadan. In the name of the British, they see Berithish, referring to the Hebrew covenant with God. Now, there is a story that there were ships of Dan in Egypt, because Dan is known for his seafaring abilities, and that at the time of the Exodus from Egypt, that these particular tribes of Dan actually left, not with the 12 tribes of Israel, but moved out into the unknown world. And if that's true, then it's the potential that all of these places named after Dan actually came from those seafarers of Dan, who later became the Phoenicians. Bedi died in 735. So Bedi, also known as Saint Bedi, a venerable Bedi, and Bedi the Venerable, was an English monk, author, and scholar. He was one of the greatest teachers and writers during the early Middle Ages, and his most famous work, Ecclesiastical History, had linked the Picts to the Scythians, but British Israelites suggested that he had confused the two tribes of Scotland and that it was the Scots who were one of the Scolotai Scyths of Herodotus. They drew particular support from the derivation of the Scots from the Scythians around the 1320s. Declaration of Arbroath, reflecting a tradition related in the 9th century Historia Britannium that the Scots descended from the union of the Scythian exile with Scota, daughter of a pharaoh, a tale found in some form in several other early 14th century historical poetic sources. The declaration begins. So here we go, like the daughter of Pharaoh. This ties back to that story of the tribe of Dan leaving Egypt. Moses' mother was the daughter of Pharaoh. So, if this story is true, then it's not necessarily Scythian exiles. It could be just tribes of Dan who left Egypt at that time. Most Holy Father and Lord, we know, and from the chronicles and books of the ancients, we find that among other famous nations, our own, the Scots, has been graced with widespread renown. They journeyed from Greater Scythia by way of Tyrrhenian Sea and the Pillars of Hercules, and dwelt for a long course of time in Spain among the most savage tribes, but nowhere could they be subdued by any race, however barbarous. Thence they came 1,200 years after the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea to their home in the west, where they still live today. So here they're saying that it was 1,200 years after they left Egypt. So, I'm not saying that the Scots or people weren't lost tribes. I just don't think that they came from the Scythians personally. It says other Celtic invaders would be given an analogous descent. In the Welsh, Cymry, the British Israelites would see a direct connection through the Cimbri to the Cimmerians and Gimri of Assyrian annals, a name sometimes also given by the ancient Babylonians to the Scythians and Saka. Now, I've done, as I said in my video, some information on this, and this was actually kind of confusing because the Gimri or the Cimmerians were south of the Caucasus Mountains. The Scythians came from the north of the Caucasus Mountains. They invaded down and at one point kind of blended and also fought each other. But the Cimmerians showed up out of nowhere within this region in as far as history is concerned. And as I said, they disappeared, whereas the Scythians stayed where they were. And we know that Ashkenaz was a son of Gog Magog and the sons of Japheth. The Bible tells us that. Cymry would lead the British Israelites to claim that the Welsh too were members of the lost tribes. So according to the Anglo-Israelites, these claimed connections would make the British the literal descendants of the lost tribes and thus inheritors of the promise made to the Israelites in the Old Testament. And here we have the biggest load of crap that I believe these people push, is that the British royal family are the line of David. And some adherents further claim that the British royal family is of lineal descent from the house of King David by the daughter of Zedekiah. Now, the British royal family are German. They're not even from the original British royal family. I mean, the last true king of England was living in Australia, and he was just a farmer or a truck driver. Basically, his family had been pushed out by the current British royal family, and they had emigrated here to Australia. That story's on YouTube. According to this legend, the prophet Jeremiah and his scribe Baruch escaped with the king's daughter to Egypt. They later traveled to Ireland, where one of the surviving Judahite princesses, Tia Tefi, married a local high king of Ireland. From his fabled union, the Davidic throne was supposedly preserved, having been transferred to Ireland, then Scotland, and later England, whence the British monarchs are alleged to have descended. The stone of Scone, which has been used in the coronations of Scottish, English, and British monarchs for centuries, is traditionally claimed to be the pillow stone on which the biblical patriarch Jacob slept, and the stone used in Davidic coronation. And we know who is the actual descendant of King David, and that's Jesus, and that's through the line of Mary and Joseph. So now they're saying that Britain and America inherit the birthright of Jacob. Well, I'm not denying that. I actually think there is enough history and evidence to show that the people of Europe were lost tribes of Israel, and they moved out into these regions way back when I believe the Cimmerians moved out of the region of modern-day Turkey and into Eastern Europe, and then across into Germany, and then from there they basically populated all the regions of Europe. But why am I saying that this is not a good movement to get involved in? And I think that this movement, as I'm showing here, that these people knew who the descendants were. And there's people within this movement finding out historical evidence. And like, for example, I'm thinking this person, John Williams, and they're hijacking this movement. And we can see way back earlier, as if you go back and watch my German videos, that we have these same rabbis and families, rabbinical families, who are pushing the German Romantic period, and that German people descended from these pagan worshippers of Thor, and basically established a foundation for the Nazi Party in the early 20th century to say that the people of Germany and the Gauls were actually Aryan people or descendants of the Iranian people who were descendants of Japheth. So, I mean, they're creating, again, an Hegelian argument that is contradicting on each side to get what they want. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And what did they gain out of the Nazi Party and out of British Israelism was the modern state of Israel, the new neo-crusade. It says here, peak adherence to British Israelism, late 19th to 20th, early 20th centuries, the extent to which the British clergy became aware of the existence of the movement may be gauged by the comment which Cardinal John Henry Newman, an English Catholic theologian, academic, philosopher, historian, writer, and poet. He was previously an Anglican priest and after his conversion became a cardinal. So he's jumped ship to the Catholic Church as well. And he made a comment. He was asked why he had left the Church of England in 1845 in order to join the Roman Catholic Church, and he said that there was a very real danger that the movement would take over the Church of England. So in the late 19th century, Edward Hine and Edward Wheeler Bird and Herbert Aldersmith developed the British Israelite movement. Hine and Bird achieved a degree of doctrinal coherence by eliminating competing forms of ideology. So here we go. We've had these people come into this movement and they're eliminating competing forms of ideology or anything they don't like. In 1878, the Anglo-Ephraim Association of London, which followed Wilson by accepting the broader community of Western European Germanic peoples as fellow Israelites who were also favoured by God, was absorbed into Bird's Metropolitan Anglo-Israel Association, which espoused the Anglo-exclusive view promoted by Hine. So Edward Hine, who was an influential proponent of the British Israelism in 1870 and 1880s, drawing on the earlier work of the Richard brothers, we'll have a look at them in a moment, and John Wilson. So John Wilson, we've had a look at him. Hine went as far as to conclude that it is an utter impossibility for England ever to be defeated, and this is another result arising entirely from the fact of being Israel. He was a bank clerk by occupation. Okay, is that alarm bells there? Anyone related to a bank? Hine claimed that he had been inspired by a lecture given by Wilson, which he had heard at age 15, but he himself did not publish on the topic for nearly 30 years, giving his first public lecture in 1869. For several years, Hine published a weekly journal, The Nation's Leader, and the monthly magazine Life from the Dead from 1873 onwards. In 1880, Hine founded his own British Israel organisation, the British Israel Identity Corporation. Now, here's where it gets weird. So, David Barron, in his History of the 10 Lost Tribes, cites claims identifying Hine himself with the deliverer announced in Romans 11:25. The British people are identical with the lost 10 tribes of Israel and is the nation by the identity being led to glory. If these things are so, then where is the deliverer? He must have already come out of Zion. Okay, that's blasphemous. We know our deliverer is Jesus. He must be doing his great work. He must be amongst us. It is our impression that by the glory of the work of the identity we have come to the time of Israel's nation salvation by the deliverer out of Zion, and that Edward Hine and that deliverer are identical. And who is David Barron? Well, let's have a look. David Barron, Messianic leader, was a Jewish convert to Protestantism and co-founder of the Hebrew Christian Testimony to Israel missionary organization. He was born Jewish parents in the town of Suwalki, then part of the semi-autonomous Kingdom of Poland in the Russian Empire. I wonder if he's related to Sacha Baron Cohen. In later life, Baron would claim that after an illness which nearly claimed his life, he began to experience spiritual distress, which eventually culminated in a religious experience whereby at last God revealed himself to me and he became convinced of the need for blood atonement. Was that little Christian children? Raised as an Orthodox Jew at the age of 10, Barron enrolled in the yeshiva where he excelled in his studies and won a volume of commentary on the Talmud. In his teens, he intended to emigrate to America with a brother-in-law, but a theft compelled him to give his brother his share of the money to continue the journey while he remained in Hull, England, where he first encountered Christianity. So he's giving praise to this Hein character, this David Barron, about being some kind of Messiah to the Zion, deliverer of Zion, and his British Israel movement. So here we see that quite quickly this British Israel identity has been hijacked by these people. Hein in turn inspired Edward Wheeler Bird, who eventually came to see Hein as a rival rather than an ally. The main point of contention between Bird and Hein was that the former tended to identify all Teutonic peoples as descendants of the Israelites, while Hein reserved his status for the Anglo-Saxon, interpreting the name Saxons as the sons of Isaac, preferring for Germany the role of Assyria. And when was this? In what year was this? Let's have a look. 1880. So this is about the time of the German Romantic period. So they're already promoting this philosophy in the general public psyche that, Germans are Aryans and British are sons of Isaac. And we've got, these people who are related to the Disraelis. So Hein's ideas thus influenced the nascent Anglo-Israelite movement in the United States, where they are still advocated by some Christian white supremacist fringe groups, which turned to anti-Semitism. For example, Clifton A. M. Heiser's Church of True Israel, identifying the Anglo-Saxons as the true Israelites and the modern Jews as Canaanites, who must be exterminated according to Jewish law. Well, again, the Hegelian argument. Rather than saying, okay, historical evidence points to the fact that most of today's Jews we know are actually descendants of Japheth and not descendants of Shem or Jacob, is historic fact, but now we're going to push it down into this white supremacist, Nazi, racist identity that now anyone who says that the European people are lost tribes of Israel end up in this big basket of white supremacists. And it says maybe Britain is unaware that Canaanites are the Jews, as we have the same problem in the United States. It says likewise followers of Christian identity movement claim that they are descendants of the biblical Israelites, where the Jews are the children of Satan. Well, there is no such thing as Satan. If anything, as I said, most Ashkenazi Jews that we know today, they're just children of Japheth. And as I said in Genesis, it actually says that the children of Shem, who was the basically father of the line of Jacob and Jesus, would dwell in the tents of Japheth. So, they're three sons of Noah, basically. Satan, no such thing as Satan. It's just the line of Cain, the seed of the serpent who was Adam, the seed of the woman who is Eve, or, the seed of the woman is Mary, Jesus, because women actually don't have seed. So there's something more going on in that scripture. It says this development is an inversion of the motivation of Hein, who was in fact a philo-Semite, so he was pro-Jews. The Worldwide Church of God of Herbert W. Armstrong also perpetrated Hein's identification of Germany with Assyria. How is Germany Assyria? I mean, most of England is German. Way back there, they're all related. So, they're basically the same people. As I said, they pushed this idea of Germany being Aryan in the German Romantic period. This was pushed by the Mendelssohn family, who were related to the Rothschild family, and a few other Jesuit associates. Go back and watch my videos on the German Romantic period. So they're comparing the Nazi Holocaust with the destruction of Israel by Sargon II into the 1980s. So, I mean, this is just stupid, and it goes way back to the 16, 17, and 1800s. They're promoting this philosophy within the general psyche of these people, of all of our ancestors, of our people, to promote an idea that was going to get them the modern state of Israel. So Cecil Rhodes was a supposed believer in the British Israelite movement. Here we've got about the Rhodes Milner Group. Rhodes talked about starting an organization to preserve and extend the British Empire. He said in 1877, "It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory. More territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, most honorable race the world possesses. The absorption of the greater portion of the world under our rule simply means the end of all wars." It was this mentality that fueled his desire to unite the world under one form of government, using the Jesuits and the Masons as organizational models. Rhodes joined together with Rothschild agent Lord Alfred Milner, 1854 to 1925, to form a secret group on February the 5th, 1891. The group included other Ruskin associates at Oxford, such as Arnold Toynbee, Arthur Glazebrook, Sir George Parkin, Philip Littleton Gale, and Sir Henry Bishnot. So, Cecil Rhodes, when he died, basically donated all of his wealth to the Rothschild family. It says here, their group had an inner circle known as the Circle of Initiates, led by Rhodes, and included an executive committee with Steed, Brett, and Milner, the chief Rhodes trustee. Other members included Lord Arthur Balfour, of the Balfour Declaration, British Foreign Secretary who wrote the Rothschild promising his support for the establishment of the Jewish homeland in Palestine, Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, Sir Harry Johnson, and Lord Albert Grey. So the Round Table Society, the outer circle, was known as the Association of Helpers, but was not implemented until 1909 and 1930, when Milner established it as the Round Table Organization. The goal was to eventually establish a one-world government which would be controlled by the international banking community under the cloak of socialism. They saw England as a European power but an Atlantic power, and wanted to have federation of the English-speaking world which would be controlled by them. In 1897, British and American elitists met in order to come up with ways to accomplish Rhodes' plan to consolidate their respective governments, which would pave the way for a one-world government. On July 24, 1902, a secret organization known as the Pilgrim Society was started in London. 6 months later, an American branch was established in New York, founded by the Rhodes Foundation. They were instrumental in taking control of the Democratic Party in the United States. So here in this Oxford article, Cecil Rhodes and the Religion of Race. And in Cecil Rhodes' own words, he says, no document speaks better to Rhodes' ideology than his own writings. In 1877, at the age of 24, Rhodes was still an undergraduate, splitting his time between Oxford's rainy skies and the arid warmth of Kimberley, a mining town in the middle of South Africa. 2 hours' drive from Bloemfontein. He wrote of his goal in life being to further British rule, contending the British to be the finest race in the world, and adding that every acre added to our territory provides for the birth of more of the English race, who otherwise would not be brought into existence. He asserted he would work for furtherance of the British Empire, for the making of the Anglo-Saxon race into one empire. He wrote 6 wills detailing this desire for a secret society that will colonize all lands where the means of livelihood are attainable, so that Great Britain is to establish a power so overwhelming that wars must cease, and the millennium will be realized. Now, given all of his connections to the Rothschilds, leaving his wealth to the Rothschilds, and his beliefs in different people, we know that Rhodes motivation wasn't really the Anglo-Saxon race, because look what actually came out of all of this work that these people have done. It's been to the destruction, the open destruction of the Anglo-Saxon race. Says he penned these thoughts in a document termed as Confession of Faith. His appeal predated his wealth, an element of dedication to the cause beyond himself, clearly evident of these texts being at best an agnostic. Rhodes' view was that if God did exist, the role set out for him was the perfecting of the race by a process of natural selection. He wrote, "If there be a God, I think that he would like me to do this, to paint as much of the map of Africa British red as possible." British red, or like Edomite red. "To extend the influence of the English-speaking race. There is nothing so certain," said Rhodes, "than the natural inequality of men." So Rhodes' faith was his assertion of the supremacy of white Europe, an amalgamation of the writings of John Ruskin, the ethics of Aristotle, and the science of Charles Darwin, which brought about the communists and Marx. I mean, these people were all in the same groups. And, if he had no belief in God and he was agnostic, why was he bringing about this millennium? What millennium's that? The millennium of the control of these Rothschild people and the modern state of Israel? Working close with Disraeli and Balfour to get this declaration signed and to take this land and to establish themselves again in this land as they did in the Crusades. The same agenda of the Edomites trying to take back the city of Jerusalem and the Holy Land. So I'll just go back to this person, John Wilson. John Wilson was born at Kilmarnock, Scotland in 1779 and commenced his inquiry into the Israelitish origin of the Anglo-Saxons in the year 1837. Studying at great length in the library of Trinity College, Dublin, he succeeded in tracing the Anglo-Saxons as far back as Media. In the following year, he gave a series of lectures which proved to be most successful. Owing to the popularity, he published his lectures in book form in 1840 under the title Our Israelitish Origin, in which he traced the migrations of the people of Israel as they made their way across the continent of Europe to these isles. He brings evidence to bear from Diodorus and from Ptolemy, supporting the earlier history of the Israelites. He studies the works of Rawlinson, Herodotus, and Josephus, and quotes extensively from Sharon Turner. Well, we know that Sharon Turner really can't be trusted, can he? Because Sharon Turner was good friends with the father of Benjamin Disraeli. But we don't know that John Wilson knew that, and he may have found some really convincing information in his studies. The lectures given by John Wilson attracted the attention of very distinguished men, amongst them being none other than the eminent Sharon Turner himself. Yeah, so they were spinning this story to suit themselves. Also, Piazzi Smythe, Astronomer Royal for Scotland and one of the first interpreters of the Great Pyramid Prophecy. The Reverend F.R.A. Glover, compiler of the genealogical chart of Her Majesty Queen Victoria, and Dr. George Moore, author of the Lost Tribes or Saxons of the East and West. It was at one of these lectures that Edward Hind had his heart and his eyes opened to the glorious heritage which is ours, upon the realization of the tremendous responsibilities of this God Yahweh servant nation. He, from that time forward, devoted a large part of his life to the study of the wonderful truth, lecturing for several years in England, Ireland, and Scotland, touring America for about 3 years. His first book to be published was 7 Identifications, followed by 27 Identifications. These were soon increased to 47 Identifications. Not long afterward, he started a monthly publication, Life from the Dead, in 1873. This was followed by Leading the Nation to Glory, which was afterward named The Glory Leader. In Mr. Wilson's house near St. Pancras, the Anglo-Israel Association was founded. This was followed by the British Israel Identity Corporation about 1880, of which Edward Hind was the founder. A weekly publication named the British Israel and Judah Prophetic Messenger and Universal News was started, which later was renamed the Messenger, and later still changed its name once more to the Covenant People. After the death of Edward Hine, the Banner of Israel became the weekly journal Anglo-Israelites throughout the world. This journal, together with the Covenant People, was incorporated in the National Message, which came into circulation 2 years after the inauguration of the British Israel World Federation. And here it says, let us conclude with a few words of these two worthy gentlemen, quoting First Reverend John Wilson. Upon this nation and the multitudes of nations to whom they have given and are giving birth in all their ends of the earth has fallen the lot of ministering the word of the Lord Yahweh to all the nations of the earth. God Yahweh has done for them and enabled them to do great things for themselves and others. But in nothing have they been more signally favored than in this, that them has been committed that which was taken from the Jews, the keeping of the oracles of God Yahweh, the ministration of the bread of life to all Israel people, causing to be proclaimed in all languages these wonderful works of God. Soon may the Spirit be poured upon us from the high, giving clearer understanding of the words which have been uttered, so that our lives and voices shall be attuned to welcome our returning King, who is about to come forth in glorious majesty to reign. Quoting from 27 Identifications by Edward Hine. And I'll just quote Matthew 3:2 here. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. This was said by John the Baptist, who was referring to Jesus, declaring that the kingdom of heaven was here in the presence of Judea, not waiting for a revelation of the kingdom in the century of the 1800s. So we've got John Wilson's early life here. It says rediscovery of Israel. John Wilson's mother had early called his attention to the extraordinary blessings pronounced on Joseph for the later days, Genesis 49. After conducting an evening service at Cork one Sunday, Miss Cummins of Glenmere asked him the meaning of Jacob's prediction of Joseph. His bow abode in strength, Genesis 49:24. He confessed his ignorance, but proposed they should both study the matter and compare notes the next Sunday. With his usual thoroughness and energy, Wilson, during the week, read, searching, and pondering concerning this subject. One day he accidentally, as it seemed, discovered in the Saturday magazine where it mentioned that Sir John Fortescue, an English medieval judge, declared that the might of the realm of England standeth upon her arches, and observed that all the great battles of England, i.e. Crecy, Poitiers, Agincourt, etc., were gained by the English longbow. Wilson was greatly struck with this, and while pondering it deeply, a light, he said, seemed to flash into his mind with the thought, can there be any connection between the bow of Joseph and the bow of England? He dedicated the rest of the week to this line of investigation, and when he met Miss Cummins on Sunday, told her he was not yet fully prepared with an answer, but he gained such an insight that he would soon give a lecture on it. He purchased Henry's voluminous History of England, read it at Trinity College Library, Dublin, obtained fresh books from old books, shops and friends, and at length obtained sufficient evidence to lay the matter before others in a lecture. Some of these people that he's quoting up here, some of these people connected to these aristocrats and elitists who wanted to spin this story in their own direction. Success determined Wilson to enter upon a larger field of England. He commenced in 1840 with courses at Liverpool, Leamington, Kenilworth, Warwick and Cheltenham, receiving great appreciation from large and most attentive audiences who generally requested a repetition of the lectures. Many questions, objections, etc. were brought forward after each lecture, and these gave additional evidence as his answers always either convinced or silenced his objectors by their masterly character. Many now requested him to print his lecture, and at length friends in Liverpool enabled him to bring out his first work entitled Our Israelite Origin in 1840, and the subsequent publications mentioned in the article were not now enabled. It had a large scale and 5 editions, having appeared that in 1876 were edited, revised and enlarged by his daughter. His influence in preparing the way for other workers has been enormous, making him truly the father of the rediscovery of Israel. So yeah, I mean, we've got this British people as, the lost tribes, but the German people are Assyrians, which doesn't make any sense because they're practically the same people almost. They've pushed this Aryan origin onto the German people. Oh, rhetoric confuses me because we have Asher. It's the biblical character, second son of Shem, son of Noah. So they're Shemites or Semites. Assyria was named after him, although the name Ashur is sometimes used to refer to the place where his descendants dwell. It says biblical name for Assyria, Ashur, a city characterized by the mounds of Kala Shurgat on the west bank of the Tigris. In Genesis 2:14 was the primary capital of Assyria about 1700 BC. Bel-Kapu founded this city. Afterwards, the capital was changed to Nineveh, now Koyunjik, on the eastern bank of the river. King of the Assyrian gods, Ashur was the father of Assyrians. He gave power to the life to every priestly king. A winged circle or globe with a human figure of a warrior god armed with a bow. So it's so interesting that he's referring to Britain as Joseph's bow when the real bowed warrior was Ahura Mazda of the Persians. That the Persians took on from the Assyrians because they took over Media Persia. In its center was used to symbolize him as the great god, king of all gods. Also, Ashur was used as part of a compound name for various Assyrian kings. So the Assyrians were Semites, but they were not Israelites. They didn't have the blessing of Jacob. So the whole argument does not make any sense here. When we go to Aryan, it says here that the succor included groups who were part of the Zoroastrian and Aryan family. So are they referring to the Persians or the Zoroastrians now as Aryans opposed to Assyrians? They include the Khwarezmi from Khwarezm. I can't pronounce these names. The Parthians, and the Dahi, and the Sistani. The largest number of ancient Zoroastrian related ruins and artifacts include Dakama, a Zoroastrian burial tower. So they're saying here that the Sakai, the Scythians, are Aryan. However, when we look into the genealogies of Genesis, the Scythians were Ashkenaz, and the sons of Ashkenaz were Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. They're telling us that the Scythians were actually Japhites, not Semites. I guess this went into theme with the story of pushing the Jews out of Europe and into the modern Israel and establishing that land there. So Moore is a really interesting name popping up again because remember John Dury. So we have Dorothy Dury, who was the wife of John Dury. She was born Dorothy King, first married named Dorothy Moore in 1618 to 1645, was an Anglo-Irish writer on education. And she was part of this Hartlib circle that corresponded with Zinzendorf. And it says Dury was born in Dublin about 1613. Her father was Sir John King, who died in 1637, of Boyle Country, Roscommon, clerk of the town and Hanaper, and a member of the Irish House of Commons. And her mother was Catherine Dury. So she was obviously related to John Dury, probably a cousin via her mother's side. Daughter of Robert Dury of Loughlinne and Elizabeth Carew, and grandniece of Sir William Dury, Lord President of Munster. So these weren't just nobodies. She had 8 siblings, including Sir Robert King of Boyle Abbey and poet Edward King, whose early death inspired John Milton to write the poem Lycidas. Her English father was based mainly in Dublin, but he had been granted lands by the Crown in Ireland under dubious circumstances. By the time of his death, he held land in 21 countries in all. He sat in the Irish House of Commons as MP for Roscommon and held numerous public offices. It says in August 1642 she moved to the Netherlands in order that she could renew her friendship with Calvinist divine John Drury, who was a friend of John Milton's. And, like I said above, obviously a cousin. It wasn't just a friend, it was a relative because her mother was a Drury. That's spelled different. Drury with a Drury, whereas this Jury without the R. But, there's a few different spellings actually of her name as well. It's Jury with a Durie or Dury. So, probably a family member here. So in around 1618, she married author Arthur Moore, fifth son of Garrett Moore, 1st Viscount Moore, and Mary Colley, who owned 1,000 acres in Ireland and was known to enjoy his drink. They had 2 sons, Charles and John. He died on the 9th of April, 1635, and Drury moved to London where she stayed with Catherine Boat and her husband Gerard Boat, physician and author of A Natural History of Ireland. So we have a look at Garrett Moore, the 1st Viscount Moore, and he was knighted by Elizabeth I. He married Mary Colley, daughter of Sir Henry Colley, and his wife Catherine Cusack, daughter of Sir Thomas Cusack, Lord Chancellor of Ireland. So they had 7 children, and one was Arthur, who married Dorothy King, or Dorothy Drury. Now, I found this family on Fab Pedigree, but it's Gerald Moore, 1st Viscount of Drogheda Moore. It's obviously the same family. And if we go back here on the father's side, we have, or the mother's side, I should say, Mary Washington. I wonder if they're related to the Washingtons of the US. Because there seems to be a lot of connections here to, with this group of people and the Puritans and the United States. So we've got Mary Washington. She goes back to the Worsleys. Robert Washington. So Gerald, 1st Viscount. So it doesn't actually say Arthur here. It lists Arthur as his children. If we go to Charles, the 2nd Viscount, he has other children here. And again, Cusack family, and it goes back to Robert Washington here. And here we have Henry Hamilton Moore, who was a child of Charles, the 2nd Viscount of Drogheda, who is related to Princess Diana's family, the Spencers over here. And another name of the early founders of America, Hamilton. So George Moore, physician and British Israelite. After attending Abernethy's lecture and surgical practice in St. Bartholomew's Hospital, London, he studied anatomy in Paris in company with Erasmus Wilson. Moore worked on attempting to decipher the Newton stone, an ancient pillar stones of Scotland, their significance and bearing on ethnology. In 1865, Moore proposed that the unknown script on the Newton stone was written in Hebrew Bactrian, which was an Eastern Iranian language, by an ancient Hebrew Buddhist missionary to Scotland. Moore's decipherment was not popular with other scholars at the time, who considered the unknown script to be Latin or Old Irish, although some had proposed Phoenician. So the lost tribes and the Saxons of the East and the West, with new views on Buddhism and translations of rock records in India. Okay, so I haven't been able to find a connection between George Moore, the physician, and the British Israelitist. uh, the writer of The Lost Tribes and the Saxons of the East, or the first guy to propose that Gautama Buddha was an Israelite, and the Moors of the wife of John Jury. But I have found an interesting link with this guy, George Moore, and it's here his grandson, G.E. Moore. So he was an English philosopher with Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and earlier Gottlieb Frege, was among the founders of an analytical philosophy. He and Russell led the term from idealism in British philosophy and became known for advocating common sense concepts and contributing to ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics. He was said to have an exceptional personality and moral character. Ray Monk later dubbed him the most revered philosopher of his era. As a professor of philosophy at University of Cambridge, he influenced but abstained from the Bloomsbury Group. Bloomsbury set was a group of associated English writers, intellectuals, philosophers, and artists in the first half of the 20th century, including Virginia Woolf, John Maynard Keynes, E. M. Forster, and Lytton Strachey, whatever, however you say that. So it says here that George Edward Moore was born in Upper Norwood. He was the middle child of 7 of Daniel Moore, a medical doctor, and Henrietta Sturge. His grandfather was the author George Moore. His eldest brother was Thomas Sturge Moore, a poet, writer, and engraver. He was admired by and influenced, among other philosophers, and by the Bloomsbury Group. But unlike his colleague and admirer Russell, who for some years thought he fulfilled his ideal of genius, mostly unknown today outside of academic philosophy, Moore's essays are known for their clarity and circumspection of writing style and methodical and patient approach to philosophical problems. It says Moore was an important and admired member of the secretive Cambridge Apostles, also known as the Conversation Society, is an intellectual society at the University of Cambridge founded in 1820 by George Tomlinson, a discussion group drawn from the British intellectual elite. At the time, another member, a 22-year-old Bertrand Russell, wrote, "I almost worshipped him as if he were God. I have never felt such an extravagant admiration for anybody," and would later write that for some years he fulfilled my ideal of genius. He was in those days beautiful, slim, and with a look almost of inspiration, as deeply passionate as Spinoza's. Spinoza was a Portuguese Sephardi Jew, origin born Amsterdam and the Netherlands. Interesting that he refers to this particular person as being all of these things. And I'm just going to say the word G-A-Y. Bertrand Arthur William Russell, 3rd Earl of Russell. And we know that the Russells are one of these black nobility families. As this website here says, the Russell bloodline, one of the 13 Illuminati families, which basically tie back to the Exarch families, in my opinion. Both the Russell and the Rutherford families came from Scotland, as well as the Macmillan and many other key early Watchtower leaders. The Russells are one of the top 13 Illuminati families, and we've got Charles Taze Russell, who started the Jehovah's Witness. So once there was a Jewish family whose name was Rossel. They lived in the early 17th century Germany. They moved to Scotland. There they respelled their name Russell. They took on the ways of their new homeland. So I won't go on there and waste any more time. Bertrand Arthur William Russell, the 3rd Earl of Russell, was a British philosopher, logician, mathematician, and public intellectual. He had influence on mathematics, logic, set theory, and various areas of analytical philosophy. He was one of the early 20th century's prominent logicians. and founder of the analytical philosophy, along with his predecessor Gottlieb Frege, his friend, a colleague, G.E. Moore, and his student and protege Wittgenstein. Russell, with Moore, led the British revolt against idealism. Together with the former teacher A.N. Whitehead, Russell wrote Principia Mathematica, a milestone in the development of classical logic and a major attempt to reduce the whole mathematics to logic, see logicism. Russell's article on denoting has been considered a paradigm of philosophy. So according to this website, The Truth Seeker, Bertrand Russell's society is a conspiracy to enslave its members. Diet, injections, and injunctions will combine from a very early age to produce the sort of character the authorities consider desirable. And this is a quote from Bertrand Russell, The Impact of Science on Society, 1953. And it's got here, quote, Satanist, court jester, philosopher, Bertrand Russell, 1872 to 1970. So in the Scientific Outlook 1931, Freemason Bertrand Russell described the neo-feudal society consisting of rulers and slaves that is emerging today. Russell was not only predicting the world this would happen, but stated that it would happen in the future. Obviously, it was planned, and the things Russell talked about then are happening now. He could not have been so prescient without being part of that elite class who were implementing the plan to deconstruct our heretofore God-fearing world, Edward Menez. Bertrand Russell, a Freemason's view of life. So the British philosopher, essayist, social critic, and Freemason Bertrand Russell wrote in the Scientific Outlook in 1931, on those rare occasions when a boy or girl who has passed the age at which it is usual to determine social status shows such marked ability to seem the intellectual equal of the rulers, a difficult situation will arise, requiring serious consideration. If the youth is content to abandon his previous associates and to throw himself wholeheartedly with the rulers, he may, after suitable tests, be promoted. But if he shows any regrettable solidarity with his previous associates, the rulers will reluctantly conclude that there is nothing to be done with him except to send him to the lethal chamber before his ill-disciplined intelligence has had time to spread revolt. Think Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Bojo, think most of our traitors, so-called leaders. So the Scientific Outlook 1931 by Lord Bertrand Russell was a book promulgating the idea of monopolistic capitalism. Think BlackRock, where everything would be owned and run by a technocratic elite class. So this is, Klaus Schwab's will own nothing and be happy. The rest of us would be turned into goblins or a peon slave class. Note that just 2 years later, in 1933, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World was published, which espoused many of the same ideas, including the class structure of alpha, betas, etc. Russell was an atheist who believed in the power of science. Perhaps we ridicule those who make idols of the science today after seeing what has brought us by following Fauci, Gates, et al. Russell promoted the previous 19th century science of Darwin, for example, which tried to make atheists out of all of us, claiming we evolved from apes on a spinning ball planet created out of nothing from the Big Bang. So, this is also this Albert Pike philosophy that they would bring basically the Roman version of Christianity against Islam and the nihilists or atheists, and eventually have us all fighting each other until they brought about this religion of Luciferianism, in which at that time Israel would actually be destroyed. So in the letter to Mazzini in 1871, Albert Pike wrote of 3 world wars. So this letter was on display in the British Museum Library in London, and it was copied by William Guy Carr, former intelligence officer in the Royal Canadian Navy. So apparently the British Library has confirmed in writing to me that such document has never been in their possession. Of course, they are saying that. The First World War must be brought about in order to permit the Illuminati to overthrow the power of the Tsars in Russia and of making the country a fortress of atheistic communism. Okay, so that happened. The Second World War must be formed by taking advantage of the differences between the fascists and the political Zionists. The war must be brought about so that Nazism is destroyed and that the political Zionism be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel in Palestine. So during the Second World War, international communism must become strong enough in order to balance Christendom, which would be then restrained and held in check until the time when we would need it for the final social cataclysm. Now, aren't they trying to use that now? So there's a real return of the right wing at the moment in a 1930s German style of this almost puritanism rising back up. And we have a lot of young men joining Orthodox religions. And we're seeing a lot of push for this perfect family trad wife situation, which I'm not saying is a bad thing to have good families or moral society, but it's exactly what they pushed in Nazi Germany with this perfect family scenario, which had come from a previous time of debauchery in Berlin where the left had pushed for transgenderism and homosexual relations, and it's a very similar scenario happening today where now we're seeing pushback from the right. And whenever the right push back, it becomes violent, and I'm certainly not advocating for the left here, but we really can't follow teams. We have to follow what's wise and what the Bible says and not follow sides because that's what they want us to do. They're creating these sides, Hegelian arguments to do exactly what it's saying here in this letter from Albert Pike, that they will create Zionism, they will create Christianity in the form of an Orthodox or Roman Catholic Christianity, they will create Islam, and they'll create atheism and nihilism, and they will pit them against each other to create social tensions, and therefore what will happen is out of that they get their synthesis, which is this Luciferian world order. It says the Third World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences caused by the agentur of the Illuminati between the political Zionists and the leaders of the Islamic world. Okay, this is happening right now in Israel with Iran. The war must be conducted in such a way that Islam, the Muslim Arabic world, and the political Zionism, the state of Israel, mutually destroy each other. Meanwhile, the other nations, once more divided on this issue, will be constrained to fight to the point of complete physical, moral, and spiritual, economical exhaustion. So this is exactly what I'm saying. We cannot take sides here. Just because the left is bad does not mean the right is right. And I have a friend who says that it's the wicked and the self-righteous that are both evil, and the wicked being the left, the self-righteous being the right. And we want to choose to be neither of them. We shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a formidable social cataclysm which, in all of its horror, will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, origin of savagery, and the most bloody turmoil. When everywhere the citizens obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries will exterminate those destroyers of civilization, and the multitude, disillusioned with Christianity, whose deistic spirits will from that moment be without compass or direction, anxious for an ideal, but without knowing where to render its adoration, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out in public view. This manifestation will result from the general reactionary movement, which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. I don't think so, Albert. So, what are the odds that this man who wrote a lot of material on the British Israelite movement and influenced the British people to agree with the Balfour Declaration, which was signed, that could initiate this modern state of Israel today that is included in these particular letters from Albert Pike and go along with this whole philosophy. His grandson is friends with this promoter of this philosophy, Bertrand Russell. And, talk about 6 degrees of separation. Here it says World War II was extremely productive for the Illuminati agenda and overall control. It led to an explosion of globally centralized institutions like the United Nations and the European Community, now Union, and many others in finance, business, and some military. It gave them exactly what they wanted. It also put countries under an enormous burden of debt on loans advanced by all parties, the Rothschilds and the Illuminati. Well, the Illuminati is just the aristocratic black nobility families. The Cecil family, Satanist Jews. It's a version of England, dates to 1500s. Says here from henrymacau.com. We usually associate the Illuminati with the Rothschild banking cartel, but according to Bradley Harding, behind them is the Saturnalian Brotherhood, the core 13 Jewish Jesuit satanic bloodlines. By Bradley Harding, you may not be aware of the Cecil dynasty. It reveals the direct Jewish lineage of what is otherwise widely understood to be blue blood noble titled land, ancient aristocratic British family. From The Real History, etc., page 107, the founder of the family, William Cecil, 1st Marquis of Exeter, 1520 to 1598, was Chancellor of the Exchequer for Queen Elizabeth I and played a major role in both appearing to uphold the British monarchy through difficult times and guiding the laying of foundations for what became the British Empire. Robert Cecil of the Jewish Cecil family that had controlled the British monarchy since a Cecil became the private secretary and lover of Queen Elizabeth I, Dr. John Coleman, Conspirators Hierarchy, page 201. These families constitute a financier oligarchy. They are the power behind the Windsor throne. They view themselves as the heirs to the Venetian oligarchy, which infiltrated and subverted England from the period of 1509 to 1715. I have a video on Venice and the origins of the Venetian Mask Festival, which I believe ties back to Purim and the Feast of Esther or Ashtar, where research shows subversion began hundreds of years earlier and established a new, more virulent Anglo-Dutch-Swiss strain of the oligarch system of Imperial Babylon, Persia, Rome, and Byzantium. Now, so if Cecil Rhodes is a descendant of this Cecil family. I mean, I know Cecil is a male name, but it's kind of funny that he gave his fortune away to the Rothschild bankers. And, it talks about his dreams of an Anglo-Saxon rule of the world through the British Empire, but none of the events that came out of these people's plans for the British Empire had anything to do with Anglo-Saxon people. In fact, it was a detriment to the Anglo-Saxon people and only promoted these fake Jews. The Rothschilds had a long-term plan to create a personal kingdom to themselves and the Illuminati in Palestine, and that plan included the handling of the Jewish people to inhabit this region, becoming their homeland. So Charles Taze Russell of the Illuminati reptilian Russell bloodline, that Charles Taze Russell is the founder of the Jehovah's Witnesses, if anyone didn't know that. So he's saying here he's part of the Russell bloodline, was a man who built the secret Tower Guard watchtower, better known as the Jehovah's Witness. He was a Satanist, a pedophile, according to his wife, and certainly an Illuminati. The new cult religion of thought control was financed by the Rothschilds, and Charles Taze Russell was one of their friends as the creators of the Mormons, who were also funded by the Rothschilds through Kuhn and Leib and Co. Russell. Mormon founders were all Freemasons. In 1880, Charles Taze Russell, this friend of the Rothschilds, predicted that the Jews would return to their country. This is about the only correct prediction Russell had. Why? Because that he knew that was the plan. Rothschilds, he writes, to complementing their efforts to establish a Jewish territory in Palestine. In 1917 came the famous Balfour Declaration, when the British Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour declared his government to support the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. Now, when you hear this phrase, the Balfour Declaration, you think it was a statement or some sort of public announcement, but it was not at all. The Balfour Declaration was a letter from Lord Balfour to Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild. Researchers say that the letter was in fact written by Lord Rothschild and his employee, the banker Alfred Milner. So Milner was the protege of Cecil Rhodes. One of the most important secret societies of the 20th century is called the Round Table. It is established in England with branches worldwide. This is the Round Table that orchestrates the RAU, the Bilderberg Group, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. It says here, read my book for details. It is fascinating to discover that Lord Balfour was an intimate member of the Round Table. Alfred Milner was the chief official of the Round Table after the death of Cecil Rhodes. And the Round Table was founded by Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, the three people behind the Balfour Declaration in 1917. So it's really interesting that Balfour is part of this Round Table group, and it's really hard to find any information on Cecil Rhodes' family background. It says that the Rhodes family were a middle-class family going back to farmers around the 1700s. When we talk about Cecil Rhodes in any of the information here on him, it says that we do know that he donated his entire fortune to the Rothschild Foundation. And, as a young person, is quoted, he's talking about secret societies that he's part of. So I've no doubt that he somehow was related to these families. This article from Tragedy and Hope, which you can find online, it says, why does Great Britain identify with Zionists? To answer this question, we must make ourselves familiar with the movement known as the British Israel World Federation, also known as World Federalism or British Israelism. According to Wikipedia, the British Israel World Federation was born as a movement in the 19th century and federated in 1919 during the days when the sun never set on British Empire. From 1924, the organisation maintained an office next to Buckingham Palace. In 1990, it moved to Putney on the Thames, but since 2003 has been based near Bishop Auckland in County Durham. British Israelism, also called Anglo-Israelism, is a doctrine based on the hypothesis that people of Western European descent, particularly those in Great Britain, are the direct lineage descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The doctrine often includes the tenet that the British royal family is directly descended from the line of King David. Zionists such as the Warburg, Schiffs, and Kuhn Loeb were instrumental in creation of Federal Reserve banking system, which then spawned the rise, direct financing, and protection of Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and later Hitler. The story of the 20th century democide funded by the Rothschilds' international banking syndicate is distilled in detail within monumental works such as Anthony C. Sutton's Wall Street trilogy, and Tragedy and Hope, and the Anglo-American Establishment by Carol Quigley, as well as The Secrets of Federal Reserve, Eustace Mullins. Well, we'll learn more about this in upcoming chapters. Here's an article here from it's a Jewish chronicle, the royal links that go back to Natty Rothschild. And if I scroll down, it says here in 1883, Edward wrote him a gushing letter. My dear Natty, I cannot find words too extreme in gratitude for your kindness and liberality, which you may be convinced will never be forgotten by me. It was no surprise that Natty was invited to join the Privy Council after the king's coronation in 1902. So this king was King Edward. Rothschild was friendly with the other giant figures of his age, Disraeli, Balfour, and Asquith, as well as Theodore Herzl and Cecil Rhodes. He benefited from Britain's imperial expansion and also played a role in this, particularly in Egypt and South Africa. His friendship with Rhodes enabled him to invest heavily in the diamond mines of South Africa, particularly De Beers, and to participate fully in the expansion of the deep gold mines in the Rand. Rhodes had a gargantuan vision for the British Empire obtaining mastery over the entire world. He thought that Britain should take over the whole African continent. Rothschild shared his vision to a limited extent and at times intervened to assist British imperial ambitions in southern Africa and Egypt. Until the end of Herzl's life, Natty supported his colonization schemes in El Arish and East Africa, but vetoed any suggestion of Jewish self-government. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Rothschild was prepared to see British control of Palestine, though the Jewish side of the question remained a secondary concern. Yeah, sure it did. Yeah, so, we've got all these connections here. Britain Israel Communications and Research Center. Zionism, the name given to the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, emerged in Europe at the end of the 19th century and called for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel, Palestine. By 1917, when the Balfour Declaration was published, Zionism had cross-party support in Britain as well as government backing in France, America, and other countries, while the pending defeat of the Ottoman Empire, which had controlled that geographic area for the previous 400 years, provided an opportunity for British politicians to translate their ideological support for Zionism into practice. In the period that Zionist movements called for statehood, was but one of many nationalist movements such as the Arab, Turkish, Armenian, and Kurdish, which saw the collapse of empires as an opportunity to achieve self-determination. Declaration neither signaled the start of the Jewish return to the land of Israel, Palestine, nor mass immigration to it. No, that was the Second World War that caused that. Jews had enjoyed a continuous presence in the area for centuries before the destruction of the Second Jewish Temple in 70 AD. And by the time of the declaration, approximately 80 to 90,000 Jews already lived in Palestine without the assistance of any external power. Despite opposition among many locals to Jewish immigration, some Middle Eastern leaders welcomed Zionism. As Emir Faisal ibn Hussein, leader of the Arab delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, wrote, "The Arabs look with the deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement, seeing it as helping their own people's quest for self-determination." Now, this makes a lot more sense when you understand the exarch history and the Arabic nations. The declaration itself was not a legal document, but the policy expressed the Lord Balfour to Lord Rothschild, then serving as the honorary president of the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland. In it, Balfour wrote that His Majesty's government, with the favour of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Well, doesn't hindsight change what's happening there? Or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So, with supporters of Israel celebrating it and Palestinians viewing it as a criminal act, the Palestine Liberation Organization recently raised the idea of suing the British government, and a year-long campaign has been formally launched calling on Britain to atone for what is described as big crime Britain committed against the Palestinian people. In July 2016, Palestinian Authority PA Minister Riyad Al Malachi told Arab League leaders that the declaration gave people who don't belong there, the Jews, something that wasn't theirs. Historians have offered numerous reasons to explain the issuance of the declaration. These range from trying to secure British control over a strategically important area near the Suez Canal, preventing the German government from establishing its own relationship with the Zionist movement, the hope that the Zionist movement in Russia would persuade their government to remain in the Allies' side in the First World War, Prime Minister David Lloyd George's personal belief that the Jews could provide better governance than the Arab inhabitants, and his religious belief that facilitating a Jewish return to the Holy Land was following God's plan. So that's a big one there. So this whole British Israelite movement convinced a lot of people that had no stake in this game that it was a good thing to return the Jews to this area and to create havoc in the people's lives who live there. So they believed that it was part of the plan of God. The diplomatic activity and skill of Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann and the argument that wartime Britain and post-war Zionism shared identical interests and saw the declaration as a stepping stone each needed to achieve their aims. In this article from Good Faith Media, Understanding Israel and Palestine, British Israelism and the Roots of Christian Zionism, we go down to here and it says, after all, Christian Zionism posits that the Jewish people are spiritually blind, that they will soon face a massive judgment from God that will make the Holocaust pale in comparison. Also, there will be a large-scale Jewish conversion to Christianity during the end times. Further, Christian Zionism teaches that the Jewish people must live in enmity with their surrounding Arab neighbors and actively oppose any effort towards peace between Israel and Palestine. Still, much of the Bible tells the story of Israel, and virtually every strand of evangelical theory agrees that the Israelites of the Old Testament and the Jews of the New Testament are the ancestors of today's Jewish people. They forget all the scripture that says how Israel was cut off, and that came from Jesus himself. Identity theology, on the other hand, begins with a pseudo-historical approach to the Bible and British nationalism known as British Israelism. Folk beliefs consistent with British Israelism have been present since at least the Middle Ages, and British Israelism as a doctrine emerged in the 19th century. In 1840, a self-educated Scotsman named John Wilson published a series of lectures in the book Our Israelitish Origins, wherein he posited that Israel's 10 lost tribes had actually migrated through Europe, and one tribe, Ephraim, ultimately settled in the British Isles. This theory meant that the British people were actually the descendants of the Israelite nation and heirs to all the promises contained within the Old Testament. At a time when British nationalism had been bolstered by the global power of the British Empire, the idea that the British people were indeed the chosen nation of God, as spoken of in the Bible, was not difficult to absorb. Members of the royal family became adherents of the British Israelism, and today there are members of the British Parliament, primarily from Northern Ireland, who are British Israelites. British Israelism began as a philo-Semitic teaching in the sense that Wilson and the other leaders of the movement claimed to be ethnic cousins of today's Jews. Therefore, the now recovered tribe of British Ephraim should cooperate in meaningful ways with the tribes of Benjamin and Judah, the two Israelite tribes who did not become lost, but rather sired by the Jewish diaspora. British Israelites celebrated the Zionist movement that sought to regather the diaspora in the Holy Land, and they saw Britain as the guardian of Zionism. While contemporary Christian Zionism in America does not promote British Israelism, today's Christian Zionists see themselves as fulfilling the same role. They simply replace Britain with the United States as the guardian of Israel. However, when British Israelism crossed the Atlantic, its primary contribution was not the creation of Christian Zionism, which already existed, but rather the seeding of what could become identity theology. Wesley Swift served as a minister at the Angelus Temple, America's first megachurch and the home of the famous Pentecostal faith healer Amy Semple McPherson. Sister Amy may have been a British Israelitist, as were many Pentecostal leaders in the first half of the 20th century, including the father of Pentecostalism, Charles Fox Parham, and the rivalist faith healer William Branham. Swift went beyond British Israelism by developing identity theology, serpent seed theory. British Israelism claims that both the white people of Europe, many of whom migrated to America, as well as the Jews, are simultaneously the Israel of the Bible. Serpent seed theory, however, says that Jews are impostors who claim to be Israel but are not. Their ignoble heritage begins with the devil himself. Swift claimed, drawing on ancient folk beliefs, that the devil had sex with Eve and caused her to conceive Cain. Cain, the literal son of Satan, became the father of the Jewish people, whose very existence is at enmity with God of white Israel. So we can see here what the bad doctrine about who and what Satan actually is can create these sort of mythologies about serpent seed or Satan and Eve giving birth to a seed line that is somehow different than the rest of the children of Adam and Eve. If we look at all of the message that Jesus and the apostles were talking about, it was talking about our own flesh being corrupt, and that Adam himself, Adam and Eve, sinned and therefore were corrupted. Not that some being, serpent, Satan creature created a new seed line with Eve. Also, we can see in this message that the whole British Israelite movement had a massive effect on the early charismatic church, as well as creating this Christian Zionist movement that we have today, where people have blinkers on in regards to Israel and Zionism, that somehow they are God's chosen people, and if we criticize what they do, therefore we are poking God in the eye because they are the apple of God's eye, and that they are the chosen or blessed people, despite the fact that they are blinded to the truth of Jesus. In this article, Richard Simpson, Victorian Studies, it says it's about the political influence of British Israel movement in the 19th century. And it says, the 9th of December 1917, Jerusalem fell to the British. In an interview with the Evening Standard in 1920, Max Nordau, co-founder of the Zionist movement in 1897, held, "We thought that the Messiah would be an individual, but I feel now as if it were a collective entity, and that its name might be the British nation." Now remember that in that video from the lady talking about the Sephirot, how the Zionists believe that the Messiah is themselves as a collective. This one statement vindicated just under 80 years of campaigning for the British Israel movement, not an Anglo-Jewish organization as one might expect, but a movement that believed the British were the chosen race, not the Jews, and believed the return to Palestine of the British and Jews together would bring about the second coming. Despite the plethora of primary documentation, very little has been written on the role of this movement in the 19th century. Throughout Anglo-Zionist literature and biographies of the great Victorian statesmen, there is little or no mention of this movement, which according to the Jewish Encyclopedia 1901 had over 2 million adherents. Despite an extensive press and books, they didn't quite make it into the mainstream politics as an organization. However, some of their members were very influential and indeed include some of the royal family. From their literal interpretation of Hebrew scripture within a predominantly Anglican umbrella, they certainly thought they knew where the country was going, so perhaps that took away their incentive for power. What I have tried to do in this long essay is to assess from a snapshot of 19th century British Israel publications how they reacted to and tried to influence the political world, how they manipulated biblical prophecy into a "we told you so" result, how British Israel attempted to show that the writings and addresses of public men bore undesigned testimony to the contentions of their movement, offering blind evidence, and how, strangely, after 80 years of campaigning, they were very nearly proved right. Altholz defines British Israel as a variety of British nationalism buttressed by biblical references with all the attributes of a religious movement except religion. The predominant idea of the British Israel movement was that Great Britain was the home of all lost tribes of Israel, implying that the inhabitants were God's chosen people. Its prime source of appeal to advocates was that it sought to affirm biblical prophecy directed specifically to the Anglo-Saxon race and a unique covenant with God, marking out the elite nature of that race. Against a background of British ascendancy over the course of the 19th century into the largest empire in recorded history, the concept of being a chosen people was attractive. This was fueled by new ideas of evolution and racial superiority, imbuing British society with a duty to spread a superior culture system and way of life to less developed societies, epitomized in Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden. The Royal Geographical Society had claimed in 1891 that on the topmost round of the leader stands the Anglo-Saxon, an opinion supported by Gladstone's assertion that our race constitutes a kind of universal church in politics. Rooting British Israel in the Christian concept and placing monarchic authority in the House of David, the movement became attractive and a cause of concern to the ecclesiastical authorities. The Church Quarterly noted, "It remains absolutely unintelligible to outsiders who regard with a wonder mixed with disdain its arguments and its conclusions alike, yet it seems to exercise over a continually widening circle of adherents a considerable attraction." And John Henry Newman cited fear that the Church of England stood in danger of being taken over by the Christian Israel identity movement as one of the reasons for leaving the Anglican Church. British Israelism provided the theological justification for the British Empire through the concept of birthright. This was established through the prophecy that Abraham's descendants would be an invincible great nation, numerous as the dust of the earth, including multiple nations based in an isle of land that will control the earth. The descent of the 10 tribes of Israel into idolatry and banishment into the wilderness as God's punishment provided the impetus for British Israel to follow them to the British Isles. A combination of literal interpretation of Old Testament scriptures and legendary history underpinned belief that the British were the spiritual and biological heirs of Abraham, and the royal family was directly descended from the David line of the tribe of Judah. This implied both the British Empire and Church of England were modern manifestations of the kingdom of God, justifying the British as God's chosen people, rule of the earth. The popularity of British Israel movement is very difficult to enumerate, with the late 1890s membership of the Anglo-Israel Association in Britain hovering around only 300, contrasting with the estimate of 2 million worldwide adherents. The Jewish Encyclopedia, 1901. The composition of the Anglo-Israel Association was described as clergy of diverse rank and shades of opinion: high, low, broad, and nonconformist soldiers, doctors, lawyers, magistrates, company directors, missionaries, and connecting history to the scriptures drew British Israel a large audience from the respectable and influential Victorian middle classes. Among them, the eminent Sharon Turner, author of History of England from the earliest period of the Norman Conquest, and Charles Piazzi Smythe, Royal Astronomer of Scotland, to In Our Inheritance of the Great Pyramid, 1865, asserted that the Great Pyramid was constructed in British imperial measures, later disproved by his disciple Sir Flinders Petrie. Follower Reverend F.R.A. Glover compiled the genealogical chart of Queen Victoria. Colonel John Cox Gawler, the keeper of the crown jewels, wrote For Life from the Dead and its inception in 1873. The Dr. George Moore, author of Lost Tribes or Saxons of the East and West, went on to found the Anglo-Israel Association in 1879 with Viscount Folkestone MP, the Grand Master of the Littleshire Freemasons, as president. Okay, so, I couldn't link George Moore to the Irish Moors, but, here we've got him hobnobbing with Viscounts and high-ranking Freemasons. Senior military followers included First Sea Lord Admiral Jackie Fisher, the architect of many 20th century naval principles. So in 1790 to 1805, which traced the Anglo-Saxon tribes back through Europe to the Balkans, Crimea, and Caucasus. A phrenologist and evangelist, Wilson's combination of these chronicles with Hebrew scriptures was a remarkable and unique feature of his British Israel theory. Wilson's first British Israel London meeting in 1841 was presided over by the newly enthroned Bishop Alexander of Jerusalem, and he went on to publish the Millennium and Phrenology consistent with reason and revelation. Wilson succeeded by banker Edward Hine, red flags, who lectured for several years in the British Isles, later touring America for about 3 years. His first book to be published was 17 Positive Identifications of the English Nation with the Lost House of Israel, dedicated to W.E. Gladstone by permission, a touch of irony as Hine was an opponent of Gladstone's policies. This was swiftly followed by the English Nation identified with the Lost House of Israel by 27 identifications. These were soon increased to 47 identifications in 1874, selling 177,000 copies. It is probably no coincidence that Hine published his first pamphlet in the year of John Wilson's death in 1870, as he fundamentally disagreed with Wilson in that he seeks to identify England with the tribe of Ephraim only, believing the modern nations northwest of Europe to be the other tribes, a view in which I perceive some little difficulty, but really, so far as our nation is concerned, it makes not the slightest difference, for whatever we are only a part, and that part the most favoured tribe, or whatever we compose the whole of the tribes, it is equally vital to us. Unfortunately, Hine appears to have got carried away with his own success, discarded Wilson, and proclaimed the worldwide renowned 47 identifications. The vastly popular work gave the inspiration to the identity writers of that present day. There is scarcely a trustworthy identity thought put forward by others but what has been borrowed from this book. So George Gawler and later his son John Cox Gawler were both prominent members of the British Israel movement, and George was the influential link to the Jewish Restorationist movement and senior Anglo Jewry. George Gawler was a colonel at Waterloo, governor of Australia, keeper of the crown jewels, advocate of restoring Jews to their homeland, and prolific author of British Israel press writing For Life from the Dead from its birth in 1873. Author of Tranquilization of Syria and the East, he asserted that encouraging a loyal Jewish population in Palestine, the communications and trade in the East would be protected. He accompanied Montforet on his trip to Palestine in 1849, and in 1852 helped form the Association for Promoting Jewish Settlement in Palestine. His son John Cox Gawler published a blueprint for settlement in 1874, and in 1878, which Jewish settlers used with funds from Edmund Rothschild to establish a successful colony in Palestine. So the Teutonic argument. There arose, however, a major difference of opinion in the 1870s over the Teutonic origin of the Anglo-Saxons. There were two views as to the relationship between the Germans and British Israel. Either the British race alone was identified with the tribes of Israel, that was Hind's view, or they included the landed German race, with the British being Ephraim Wilson. A case could be made that the Germans were a company of nations and competed with the British for the chieftainship of nations, and the debate raged well into the 20th century until the defeat of Germany in the Great War. It appeared to some British Israel that wherever there was an English colony, there were Germans. Protestant Germans kept the Sabbath better than the British and helped the British win at Culloden, Boyne and Waterloo, and helped in the start of the bishopric of Jerusalem. The royal family could be traced back not only through Scotland and Ireland, but also Germany. Advocates of the non-Teutonic Hind theory maintained Prussia and later Germany swarmed Britain's possessions because they had none of their own. Hind maintained that the 10 tribes of Israel were included within the British race, excluding the continental Teutonic nations, and the opinion held by some that they did include Teutonic was the reason why identity had made no progress. Reverend A.H. Sates reinforced his opinion in a speech to the Anthropological Institute in 1875 when he maintained that despite the presence of German words in the English language, if language is the test of social contact, it might be asserted with equal precision that it is not a test of race, referring to the followers of the late John Wilson, who maintained that the Germans, Dutch, Belgians, Danes, and Norwegians formed the Teutonic tribes of Israel. He asserted they were wrong, as it was only the British who operated the imperial weight and measurement system. To Teutonic German colonization was proof that Germany was part of Israel. Gadd, noting that the Germans attached themselves to British colonies, countering speculation that the new Germany from 1870 was an ocean power holding a colonial empire and war was inevitable. It was pointed out that if Germany and even France was part of Israel, the outlook would be peace. However, it was conceded that the German annexation policy, e.g. the north coast of New Guinea in 1884, was causing concern, and German colonist aspirations eventually became one of the issues which forced the topic of confederation of the British Empire to the front of British Israel commentary at the beginning of the 20th century. In particular, the Standard of Israel's mouthpiece of the Anglo-Israel Association criticized Hind's absurd Anglican or anti-Teutonic theory, in which he sought to distribute the several tribes amongst the different social classes of the nation. Hind had identified the 10 tribes as being together in Britain in that Ephraim were the drunkards and ritualists, Reuben the farmers, Dan the mariners, Zebulun the lawyers and writers, Asher the soldiers, etc. They declared that the Germans spread God's word through the many missionaries of the Moravian churches and drew attention to the pettiness of condemning a nation because it differed in national commercial arguments of weight and measures, i.e. metric Teutonics. Queried how Hind managed to identify the cursed mark of the beast, with the metric system, pointing out that Sharon Turner, on whom both sides depended, spoke of the Teutonic stock of Europe. On the 2nd April 1866, Professor Piazzi Smythe of the Royal Society of Edinburgh gave an account of his measurements of the Great Pyramid, concluding that whatever its subsequent use, it was originally constructed as a standard for imperial weights and measures. British Israel advocated against the French metrical agitators, arguing that because of the size of the empire, the imperial system was better. Not only that, but adoption of the metric system was expensive, and as the imperial system was part of identity with Israel, MPs advocating adoption of the French metric system were evil. In fact, it was the astronomer Royal Piazzi Smythe who in 1870 decided that as a Prussian king had adopted the metric system, they were not Israel. Quoting Sharon Turner's Teutonics, pointed out the Anglo-Saxons were not of German origin. The fact that they passed through the region now known Germany did not constitute them Germans. The British Israel movement crossed denominational lines but was predominantly Anglican, but despite an anchor in the Church of England, British Israel appeared across multi-denominational Protestantism. The key to this was its literal interpretation of the Old Testament in stressing its identity with the British Empire, as opposed to diversive spiritual interpretations. The Church quarterly criticized this in that the movement is found to weaken the hold of practical religion over its adherents without giving them anything in its place. And like good Templarism, Plymouth Brethrenism, or Freemasonry, it is a quasi-religion and once accepted is looked upon as the most important of all religious truths. An argument countered by British Israel, which insisted that the knowledge of being one of God's chosen people reinforced their Christianity, and supported by the influential Bishop Titcombe, maintained that the Reformation liturgy, drawn heavily on the Hebrew Old Testament, was granted by God to British Israel, and that the reiteration of the Ten Commandments on Sunday and holy days was peculiar to Anglicans, and in 1897, Dr. Potter, Archbishop of York, had pleaded at the Lambeth Conference for a more definite union between the branches of the Church of Anglo-Saxon Christians. So you can see that they've rallied up this anti-German rhetoric between the British and the Germans pre-World Wars. Now it says here, it is ironic that a proposal to strengthen kinship between Anglicans and Lutherans originated with the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, who sent the Chevalier Bunsen to England in the summer of 1841 as a special envoy. Bunsen, Prince Albert, Lord Shaftesbury, Archbishop of Canterbury Howley, and Bishop of London Bloomfield, founded a Protestant bishopric in Jerusalem, consecrated by English bishops and exercising jurisdiction over both England and German Protestants, which was carried into effect by 1841 Act of Parliament. The first Bishop, Michael Solomon Alexander, was a converted rabbi. Of course he was. And Alexander is a really interesting ancestral name. The Jerusalem bishopric caused the stir amongst Tractarian churchmen, and John Henry Newman described it as one of the three blows which broke me, leading to the departure from the Church of England in 1845. Newman cited his fear that the Church of England stood in danger of being taken over by the Christian Israel identity movement as one of his reasons for leaving the Anglican Church to embrace Roman Catholicism. Bishop Titcombe asserted that some believed Protestantism and Catholicism were more a matter of race than belief, but he himself did not believe it was a question of ethnology. But Titcombe did maintain that the only nations yielding to the Protestant faith were Teutonic, and according to Jeremiah 3, Israel during her converted state would commence a meager return of a few of her sons to Palestine, alluding to the accomplishment by the establishment of the Jerusalem bishopric on Mount Zion under the protectorate of England and Germany. So in domestic politics, British Israel was not ostensibly a political movement, but it was inevitable that any association that interpreted biblical prophecy against the background of an actual historic real-time and future events would attempt to influence, take credit, or comment on the relevance of those events. Primarily an Anglican organization, it was inevitable that British Israel would contribute to political issues concerning the Jews, Catholics, and Palestine. In essence, the character of the movement was pro-conservative, imperialist, and anti-home rule, divided only by Teutonic theory. British Israel did have followers in both legislative houses. However, limited by significant elected representation, it promoted through various publications those influential public figures who blindly reflected its own theologically driven policies and prophecies. It is only in from the 1870s that the British Israel press really started to roll, enabling commentary on their domestic political stance. Prior to the 1874 general election, Edward Hine asserted that the British Israel movement had no motive to endeavour to operate any influence in a political sense. However, in the same year, Hine appealed for the representatives in Parliament and stressed the importance of selecting MPs indoctrinated by British Israel philosophy. There is no record of how successful his campaign was, but in the event of Conservatives under Disraeli won the majority of 52 seats, which pleased the British Israel pundits. Hine was not alone, and Viscount Folkestone, president of the Metropolitan Anglo-Israel Association and MP, asserted in 1880, "I am sure that this association in the course of time will assume a very prominent position in the history of the nation. I have no doubt but that it will exercise a great influence on the policy, both home and foreign, of our future governments." This 1880 election did, however, indicate the low influence of British Israel in the hustings. Despite pleading its non-political stance, British Israel backed Disraeli. British Israel encouraged the nation Israel to support the party that would achieve God's destiny for the nation, asking if Britain wanted to see the achievements of Disraeli, the Eastern Question, Berlin Treaty, and the proposed protectorate of Asiatic Turkey, acquisition of Cyprus and the Holy Land reserved. The Liberals under Gladstone won by a majority of the 176 seats, but true to form they found biblical prophecy to cover the non-imperial policies of Gladstone. "Come, my people, enter those into thy chambers, and shut thy doors about thee. Hide themselves, as it were, for the little moment, until the indignation be overpast." Isaiah 16:20. To mark Britain's withdrawal from expansion, it followed that British Israel did not expect Liberals to have long enough in power to affect foreign policies. Post-1880 elections, British Israel were gladdened to hear the Liberals intended maintaining the empire, but deplored its reputation of further colonial annexations, therefore not fulfilling Britain's destiny to rule the world. Sure enough, the appropriate biblical prophecy was found, and the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Daniel 7:27. The subject of the federation of the empire was becoming increasingly the subject of national concerns, and British Israel believed this was the aim of Disraeli's future policy, gleefully quoting on the subject from arch-enemy, the ultra-radical Quarterly, the Westminster Review, the organ of Bentham and of Charles Buller and of John Stuart Mill, the organ preeminently of pure philosophic radicalism article Imperium et Libertas opposing Gladstone. However, again, British Israel were at pains to point out that their politics were not party politics but Israelite and Bible politics, seeking enlargement of the empire with England. At the centre, intimating cheekily the Westminster Review had copied British Israel articles. Unfortunately, Gladstone was of the opinion that Saville, editor of the Banner of Israel, was labouring under almost a delusion. I wonder if that's for one of the Savills, like Jimmy Savile. The judgment of the national mood appeared to be correct, and pre-general election in 1885, British Israel was worried that Gladstone had been going to scuttle out of Egypt and yield to French pressure. "We hardly imagine the people of this country will give up and allow all their interests to be bartered away and ruined because Mr. Gladstone is the Prime Minister of their choice. For being without policy and statesman seems content to let Israel's blood flow in torrents. Sarcastically, they referred to Gladstone's plan as an attempt to restore Britain in Europe to perfect independence, classing it as the contest between the iron will of the Liberal leader and that of the God of Israel, and asked for the electorate to vote for God-fearing men. In fact, the French had expected the British monarchy to collapse with the Sudan fiasco and threatened invasion of India by Russia, but a comment in Revue Politique et Littéraire credited the British Empire as being more solid than was generally supposed, a point taken by British Israel as proof of God's guarantee. So we can see here that, the establishment of this British Israelite movement certainly did have a lot of influence on politics, and this one man, the families were linked to the Disraelis, and Disraeli was a big promoter of the British Israelite Zionist movement and the establishment of the Balfour Declaration. And they did a lot of work in the background to promote this idea, going all the way back to the 15 and 1600s. And it was all linked to rabbis and Sephardi Jews. And this was the political influence of the British Israelite movement and linking it to, the Zionist movement and what we have today as a potential Third World War, Albert Pike's Third World War that's happening between Israel and Iran. In future videos, I want to give more information on the Exilarchs because I think it's my belief that this conglomerate of what was once exiled tribe of David to Babylon, who became the Radhanite merchants and who mixed with the Edomites and the Idumeans and what I think were the Nabateans linked to King Herod, and the dragon that control the beasts of the sea and the beasts of the earth, who I have stated previously are the Roman Empire, and I think the Islamic Empire, the beast of the earth representing the false prophet or Muhammad, and both controlled by this dragon, which is these ancient families, Persian families, that declare that they are of this Exilarch tribe of David, but they're just a mixture of this pagan Babylonian Kabbalism. I think that these dragon people have started these two religions and have used them to control the nations since Jesus was risen. And we are now in this little season of this dragon and soon to see its end. Thanks for listening, everyone.